The United Nations once again trying to enter into our lives, enter into how we run our country. The United Nations is looking at what is called the Arms Trade Treaty. In a conference that starts later this month, they will gather in, I believe, New York to try and hammer out ways to control the trade in long guns. Sounds familiar. So does our next guest. Solomon Friedman is a friend of this program and an expert in all things firearms. Solomon, I know that you appeared a little while ago before, I believe it was the Senate committee talking about this, saying, look, we got to be worried about this. Help walk us through. I've talked about it on this show, but maybe everybody didn't see it. The UN essentially wants a global gun registry, don't they?
They want a global gun registry, and they want a global ammunition registry, and they want a global gun parts registry. I think there are really two things Canadians need to be concerned about, and this is whether you own guns or not, or whether, frankly speaking, you're interested in hunting or shooting or not. Number one, of course, Canadians need to always be suspicious of any intrusions into our national sovereignty. In other words, Canadians want laws made in Ottawa, not made in New York, not made in Belgium, not made elsewhere, number one. But when it comes to this treaty specifically, and Canadian diplomats, to their credit, have in fact flagged this to some hue and cry from the international community, there is a real sense that the people who are at the core of this are not those who are necessarily friends of freedom and democracy. You can imagine, take a Libya, for example, a Gaddafi Libya, wherein you may want to control firearms, not to prevent crime, but to ensure that your dictatorship is never toppled. And that's something we need to be very, very cognizant of.
Or as we're watching Syria play out right now, anyone giving arms to the rebel group, that would be illegal under this treaty, because the treaty calls for it to be illegal under international law for anyone to supply arms to a non-state actor, correct?
That's as it's worded now. And like I said, Canada has taken to the world stage and said that definition is absolutely inappropriate. We need to replace it with something like illegal armed groups. Because, for example, Brian, you and I are non-state actors. And as the UN Arms Trade Treaty reads now, it would be prohibited for anyone to transfer firearms even to law-abiding civilians. They're non-state actors.
So even if it's within our law for you to sell me a gun or me to go to a store and buy one, international law would say that that is in fact illegal.
And not only would it be illegal, but it would impose really onerous record-keeping and data registration requirements that, in fact, of course, represent a step back from the direction that Canada's been going in. And that's something concerning.
So why are the bureaucrats going along with this? Because I found during the Rio Plus 20, the bureaucrats were having the minister sign on to all kinds of garbage that either they A, didn't understand, or B, did understand and didn't mind that it read like the Communist Manifesto. So are the bureaucrats at Foreign Affairs getting this one and bringing up issues, or is it just because John Baird is there that he is pointing this out?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. We know, of course, that the ideal bureaucrat, of course, should answer to the minister and should really be out there conveying the minister's position. I can tell you on this file, at the very least, it appears that the Department of Foreign Affairs is really taking into consideration and taking very seriously the concerns of law-abiding firearms owners. Immediately prior to my testimony in front of the House of Commons Committee, there were two representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and both of them really had one simple message, which is Canada's current gun control scheme, our control on export and import of arms, is far superior to anything the UN could ever dream up, number one. Number two, we are going to be particularly sensitive to the rights and interests of law-abiding Canadian firearms owners. And it's very interesting because that's a tone we haven't heard from our Canadian government in Canada or abroad for a very long time.
Well, and it's one that the NDP is now speaking out of, along with their allies and organizations like Project Plowshares, which is funded by the federal government to go along to these arms-controlled trade treaties and then try and force UN-style regulation upon Canada. They don't like this at all, and in fact, they're upset that there will be protection for law-abiding gun owners in Canada, for hunters and for sport shooters. They don't want that.
No, absolutely. And they're also particularly upset at, and it may seem completely illogical to many viewers, that in fact in the UN delegation, Canada's delegation, there were members of the shooting sports associations, which of course would make perfect sense that those who would be impacted most by, for example, embargoes on certain parts or onerous restrictions that could really kill our hunting industry and our firearms importers here. We, of course, understand why those people should be included in the delegation, but representatives from Project Plowshares, for example, were up in arms at that.
All right. So how do Canadians fight back? If you're worried about this, what do you do to say, let's make sure that this doesn't happen? And again, not only if you're a firearms owner, but because you don't want laws made in New York or Geneva.
I think it's quite simple. In Canadian law, international law only comes into our system if in fact it goes through Parliament and is essentially affirmed in legislation. Canadians need to contact their lawmakers and specifically contact our Minister of Foreign Affairs, right now John Baird, and let him know very clearly we are concerned at intrusions into Canadian sovereignty, particularly where Canada has been taking some really great strides forward in no longer penalizing law-abiding citizens for the acts of criminals. And if the international community wants to do that, it should be very clear that Canada will have no part of that.
Okay, but you say that Canada has to ratify it and put it through our own parliament for it to become part of international law. I see that changing. I see that changing because if Canada signs on to a treaty, doesn't even hold a vote in Parliament, just says, we'll agree to this, and they sign on to it at the UN. Maybe they don't bring it home and vote on it, but they just say, fine, we'll do this. Judges are increasingly looking to actions like that to interpret Canadian law, or they look to foreign law to interpret Canadian law. So there is a danger of, on this issue and so many others, agreements made at the UN becoming part of Canadian law without an act of Parliament.
That's absolutely the case. And in fact, I warned of precisely that issue when I testified to the MPs. And I said to them, look, when judges draw on international norms, we may not have even brought them home. That's absolutely correct. And I think that's why what should be most particularly guarded against in this case is endorsing some sweeping statements. I think instead, and Canada is looking at language similar to this, simply to note that civilian firearms owners, law-abiding citizens who own guns, are not a piece to either international or domestic peace and security, and we should not ever see an arms trade treaty which is trying to keep hands out of rebels and guerrilla groups, who terrorists, etc., those who want to topple democratically elected governments. We should never see that being used against law-abiding citizens.
All right, Solomon Friedman, thanks so much. What are your thoughts on this? Email me directly. Should Canadian citizens that just want to own a rifle to go hunting or sport shooting, should they be treated in exactly the same way as a terrorist group? That's what the UN thinks. What do you think? Byline at sunmedia.ca. More to come.